So you're actually the first person that I'm talking to directly who has direct combat experience from the Ukraine war. I usually talk to people who think about it and write about it and analyze it, but externally who haven't had a direct exposure. And as someone who actually fought in the war, do you know, or in your view, what are the most common or most important misconceptions that people have about the war? Even people who follow it quite closely, but who don't have the same first-hand experience that you have. What are the things that people often think about the war that, as a soldier, you know that actually is not true, or it looks differently than what people assume?
So before I say what I'm going to say in answer to your question, let me make a little disclaimer here, in that what I'm going to say is going to be very critical. It's going to be critical of the Ukrainian side of the conflict, but I'm not criticizing the Ukrainian side because I don't support them. Quite the opposite. My position on the Ukraine war is quite clear. I've always supported Ukraine. I continue to support Ukraine, but when I'm critical of the Ukrainian side, it's intended as constructive criticism, and it's intended to be it's intended to stimulate learning on the part of anybody who might be listening to this podcast, including personnel from NATO militaries or the NATO security establishment. So my criticism is not meant in any kind of bad way. That said, when people ask me what's the difference between the Ukraine war as it's portrayed in the media and the reality on the ground, I sort of make this analogy where I say, in the media, the Ukraine war is portrayed as a professional level MMA cage fight between two professional level MMA fighters. And the reality on the ground is that it's a playground fight between two 4-year-old children. Not in terms of the stakes, but in terms of the levels and capabilities of the combatants. So when you follow the war in the media, you see a lot of high-end weapon systems. You get this narrative that kind of makes sense of what's going on in sort of a strategic way. The reality is that the war is very chaotic. In a lot of cases, both sides, this is not just about the Ukrainian side, both sides, it seems that they're kind of very unfocused. Unfortunately, the level of the quality of the personnel oftentimes is a limiting factor on what the militaries can do, especially what the Ukrainian military can do. So the war on the ground is really a lot more chaotic, a lot more disorganized, and a lot more sort of low level compared to what is presented in the media.
And maybe to take more of an advantage of your NATO experience or NATO military experience, and also having served in Ukraine, how and in what ways would you say that the Ukrainian military and the way it works and it operates is different from the NATO standards? And does that overall, or because I assume that probably that has some advantages, but also many disadvantages as well. Would you say that? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, fundamentally, NATO militaries, for the most part nowadays, are professional militaries, or they're militaries that have a significant professional cadre rate, whereas the Ukrainian military is a mass army with volunteers or conscripts who are just regular guys taken off the streets. So that creates a very fundamental difference in terms of how the military operates and what you can expect from the people. The standard of training, in the Ukrainian military is far lower than what you would expect from NATO militaries. From what I understand, the Ukrainian military had a certain cadre of highly trained professional troops before the start of the 2022 invasion, but it was the most professional, the most elite units that took the highest losses in the early stages of the war. So nowadays, it's actually very rare to find a Ukrainian soldier who had like serious training before the war and is still alive, is still healthy, and still fighting on the front line. Those kind of people are very rare.
And I've also heard that it's very different between different units and different battalions in different parts of the military. The standards and quality can be extremely different.
I suppose that's true, but even in the so-called elite units nowadays, because of the contingencies of the war, obviously the personnel, they don't have the opportunity to go through the same level of training as they would have had in peacetime before the war. You know, to train a really high quality military professional requires at least several months of intense, focused, high quality training. And the Ukrainians just don't have that, even in the elite units. So a lot of the training is kind of abbreviated, and that has a predictable effect on the quality of the troops.
Is that just because there's not enough time to train them properly? Or because I've heard that even now, there's a lot of issues with how Ukrainians are being trained, that, for example, they spend time, even in wartime, they spend time training very formal things like marching and those kind of things that you're trained in a peacetime military, but maybe it doesn't make that much sense to train in wartime. What's your sense? Why is the training still not really up to the standard where it maybe should be?
I think time constraints are definitely an issue. And then there are, of course, a number of other constraints. One of the major constraints is finding the instructors to actually give the training. So, you know, an instructor, a military instructor, is also a very specific kind of professional who needs to have a certain amount of experience and needs to have a certain amount of know-how. And because of the losses, because of the expansion of the Ukrainian military, there probably just aren't enough of these qualified instructors to go around.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about why there seems to be more and more war and conflict all around the globe. Why it's not just a feeling, but actually a verifiable fact. And why the increase in war can be explained with a niche mathematical theory and the plot of Jurassic Park. And what it means for the future of geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation.